All right, so we just talked about inline styling. Last week, we also talked about some of the disadvantages of inline styling and why we don't usually prefer using inline styling. So go ahead at this time, go ahead and type up what are the two disadvantages of inline styling that we talked about last week. All right, so yeah, the first disadvantage that we talked about last week is that it can quickly get really messy. So here, for example, currently we just have two style rules, right? We have that the color is green and that the background is red. But if we wanted to start adding more style rules to this H1 element, then it can quickly get really messy and hard to read. It's already a little bit hard to read. But if I wanted to add more, for example, if I wanted to say that the width is going to be 50 pixels, and that the height is, I don't know, going to be 100 pixels, then all of a sudden we just have a jumble of texts mixed in with all of our HTML elements, and it's just really messy and hard to read. The second disadvantage that we talked about last week was that once you have more HTML elements that you want to style, you end up having to repeat a lot. For example, let's imagine that on our web page, we actually had multiple H1 elements that talk about what our names are. Well, the problem with this is, as you can see, the style only is being applied to this first H1 element. And if I wanted to apply the same style for a bunch of elements, I now have to go ahead and repeat it over and over and over again to make them all look the same. Obviously, this is horrible styling. We don't actually want our web page to look like this, but you can get the point of how this is really messy, and we end up having to repeat ourselves a lot, which makes it even messier. So that's a problem. Great. So now that we've talked about the disadvantages of inline styling, let's move on to the second type of styling that we did last week, which was using external CSS. Right now, I want you to, in the text box, I want you to write up the syntax for how we would write up CSS that turns this H1 element to have a green text and then a red background. So I'm going to remove the inline styling, and your goal is to write up external CSS syntax that's going to make the text green and the background red. All right, so hopefully you remembered from last week that there is a selector when we write CSS to specify which elements we want to style. So in this case, it's the H1 element that we're using as our selector. And then we start these brackets. And then the syntax is we type out the CSS property name. And in this case, the property is color. And then the value of the property is going to be green. And then we also have background color as the next property name, and we want it to be red. And notice how much cleaner this is to be able to read. And now we have all of our H1 elements taking on these styling rules, and we only have to write it once, and it's super easy and nice to read.